we launched last year, so we didn't want it to die in its in its cradle, if you like. And we had lined up, you know, a number of speakers from various countries supposed to come, and that all had to, you know, be postponed for hopefully another year. And we were badly in need of support. And it's so typical of John in how collegiate and generous he always is, that he jumped in and very kindly accepted our invitation to come and open the first ever series of SAMS seminars online. I'm delighted and just very, very grateful for him. And also it's just great for the UCC community of medievalists and people working on the late antique period and early modernists and our friends from other places to just kind of, when we're all kind of working from home, to kind of feel that sense of community. And I'm so grateful to John for creating this opportunity for us to all be together, if only virtually. You might have seen the book that John published last year on magic, metallurgy. I'm forgetting the title now, John. You'll have to jump in here.
Magic, metallurgy, and imagination in medieval Ireland.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And the work that he's done in that area is absolutely fascinating. We benefited from a couple of years ago, and it was more than a couple of years ago in the seminar, the wonderful texts that he read with us in that seminar, but I'm sure he'll be referring to them in this talk. But anyway, I just want to say thank you so much, John, and to say thank you so much to all our community who have joined us tonight, and missing you all terribly, but I'm delighted to be able to join together virtually this evening.
Well, I'd like to second everything that Katrina has said. It's wonderful to be addressing you all, despite everything. And I'd also very much like to thank Maureen and Katrina for the invitation to do this. I'm going to endeavor to put up the PowerPoint, which worked like a charm a little bit earlier. I'll hope that it will oblige again. Is that okay for everybody?
Yeah, perfect, John. You can see it. Thank you.
Yes, perfect. You can see it, yeah.
Wonderful. So this afternoon I'll be talking about how magic is described in medieval Irish stories. This is a version of a considerably longer paper, so there will be omissions. And if you like, we can touch on some of these in the discussion afterwards. This afternoon, I'll be arguing that we can observe a development in the way in which magic is described in medieval Irish narrative. While early authors largely content themselves with portraying the effects of magic, the passage of time brings increased attention to the means by which magic is accomplished. Besides considering the evidence for this shift, I'll offer some reflections, of necessity very tentative ones, regarding its potential meaning. Although magical acts cannot be entirely separated from magical speeches, I'll here be primarily concerned with the former, as I've already discussed the latter at some length in the Charms, Charmers and Charming in Ireland collection, launched at UCC last year. To begin, how is the performance of magic described in tales of the Old Irish period, from around 650 to 900? In addressing this question, it'll be convenient to distinguish between divination, or, more broadly, the gaining of knowledge through magical means, and what I shall call operative magic, that is, magic which effects changes in perception or in physical reality. In the former case, Druids and other inspired individuals are often described as knowing hidden things without any actual divinatory practices being described. Thus Muirchew, in his Vita Sancti Patricii, written toward the end of the 7th century, speaks simply of Druids who were able to know and to foresee all things before they existed through the usage of paganism and idolatry. In the 9th century saga Togail Bruidne, a prophetess who has learned imbus forosne, or the great knowledge that illuminates, is able to see forthcoming events upon request, while the Druid Cathfad can declare the auspicious qualities of particular days. Some 9th century texts do, however, speak briefly of accompanying practices. In the saga Cathmagitureth, it is said that spells are preserved in swords, so that when they are cleaned, they will narrate the deeds that have been accomplished with them. And the glossary Sanus Cormac, written around 900, includes an anecdote in which a blind poet is able to identify the provenance of a skull by placing the end of a wand or flesk upon it. Particularly interesting is the description in the 9th century tale Scéal Duáin Vic Carol of how the shape-shifting Tuon would recover memory of his past existences by going to a specific cave where he would fast for 3 days and then fall into a sleep in which the knowledge that he sought would be revealed to him, together with the ability to assume a new form. Although not described as a ritual, this behavior is clearly supernaturally efficacious, and it can be compared to the description in Sanus Cormac of the means of gaining imbus forosne. Here, too, there is a mantic sleep, accompanied in this case by chanting, chewing raw meat, and offering the meat to idol gods. Another hint of practices associated with the gaining of knowledge is provided by the statement in the narrative introducing the 9th century riddling dialogue Imagalav in Dó Thuaradh, that the poets held that on the edge of water was always a place for the revealing of insight. When a young poet hears sounds of lamentation coming from a wave, he casts a spell or bricht upon it and learns that his father has died beyond the sea. Tales of the same period contain accounts of many other kinds of magic, such as manipulation of the weather, control of the movement of the sun and of the state of crops and herds, magical healing, hostile spells to gain the upper hand in battle, magical concealment or disguise, and shape-shifting. I can, however, think of only 2 old Irish stories that provide tales of the practice of operative magic, Tochmharc Édaoine and Cathmagitureth. Édaoine, the protagonist, Édaoine, is transformed into a pool of water when a rival strikes her with a wand, a flesk of crimson rowan wood. This association of rowan with sinister magic appears to be hinted at in other Irish sources. Thus, witches are described cooking a dog with poisons and spells on spits of rowan in the old Irish tale of the death of the hero Cuchulainn. And rowan is called wood of the Druids, filith na nruaidh, in a poem on varieties of firewood in the later tale, Adad agus a Gléide. Subsequently in Tochmharc Édaoine, placing blind puppies and blind cats at the place where men are digging into a sheath, that is, a hill inhabited by supernatural beings, renders it possible to complete the excavation. The use of dogs against the people of the Síle, or the fairies, is also attested in the early Irish laws, where the lapdog of a pregnant woman or a woman in labour is said to have the function of protecting her from magical attack. Like Tureth, we are not only told the words that were uttered in order to restore a severed arm, but are also given an account of the tripartite ritual, apparently extending over 3 days, whereby the healing was accomplished. There is also what appears to be an instance of war magic, when the divine leader Lugh declaims an evidently magical speech immediately before the climactic battle. He does so upon one foot and with one eye closed. These descriptions are fascinating, but I cannot bring forward anything of this sort apart from what is afforded by these 2 texts. It seems that, with only a few exceptions, writers of tales in the Old Irish period refrained from describing magical practices, unless these entailed the gaining of knowledge. Why should magic of this kind have received a different treatment? An answer can perhaps be found in the special position of the filith, a class of poet-scholars who were accorded exceptionally high status in early Irish society. While the filith of the historical period were clearly, and indeed inevitably, Christians, and were moreover closely associated with the institutional church, their origins lay in the pagan period, and their office was traditionally bound up with supernatural powers of perception. Not only did the word fili itself originally mean seer, while its synonym aegis, going back to a different root, originally meant one who sees within, but the possession of imbus forosni, the clairvoyant faculty already mentioned, was held to be a requisite for the highest rank of fili. And imbus forosni belonged unequivocally to the native supernatural. Thus, one old Irish treatise on the nature of poetic inspiration, while speaking of the inspiration that comes from the Holy Spirit, derives imbus by contrast from the Sheathe, the hollow hills which, as already mentioned, were the dwellings of the spirits of the land. Against this background, it's not hard to see why mantic practices linked with the filith should have had a place in literature, while other sorts of magic, although leaving traces in the laws and elsewhere, should not have been regarded as appropriate elements for stories. We can now turn to tales of the Middle Irish period, around 900 to 1200. To what extent was this tendency, which we've observed in the earliest literature, modified with the passage of time? The earliest version of the saga Togail Bruidne to survive in its entirety, held to date from the 10th century, describes a prophetic ritual called the Tarvesh, or bull sleep. This is said to have been used to determine the identity of the next king of Ireland. A bull used to be slaughtered by them, and a single man would eat his fill of it and would drink its broth, and the oar of truth would be chanted over him as he lay. It is the man whom he would see in his sleep who would be king, and he would perish if he would speak a falsehood. As in Scéal Duáin, sleep brings revelation, but here of the future rather than of the past. But the similarities with Sanus Cormac's account of Imbus Forosni, where meat and chanting also play a part, are even more striking. That these resemblances coexist with equally striking differences renders it unlikely that the parallel can be simply explained in terms of literary derivation. There is a very different description of a sleep-related divination ritual in another 10th century tale. This is Tochvark Aleve, which recounts how the hero Finn MacCovel wooed and married Alva, the daughter of Cormac, King of Ireland. Early in the story, Alva goes to her father's druid, Kithruith, seeking to learn the identity of her future husband. He replies, "Ask that a glass vessel be brought to me, and in it the foam of true ale, and I will put a sleeping spell in it for you, and you will see the colour and appearance and semblance of the man to whom you will go. And come before sunrise tomorrow, so that you may tell me." After she drank that draught, the vision came to her, and she went in the half-light early, before sunrise, taking what she had seen to tell it to the druid. Here, there are two components: the ale, drunk from a vessel of designated type, and the spell, or brecht, which is recited over it. While the compound sleeping spell might be expected to designate a spell used to induce sleep, in this case, it's evidently employed to grant magical faculties to natural sleep. It's curious that it is specifically the foam, the uan of the ale, over which the charm is recited. Might this be because foam is neither one thing nor the other, being neither liquid nor solid, and can therefore function on the threshold between one kind of knowing and another? This liminal character of foam figures in the Mahabharata's story of how Indra, who had promised not to kill the demon Vrtra, either by day or by night, or with anything that was either wet or dry, slew him at twilight with a mass of foam. In these terms, the detail in our story can be compared with the statement in Imagel Vindal Thureth that revelation came to poets on the edge of water, again a liminal situation. Second recension of Lever Gavle Éireann, an extended account of Ireland's legendary past, appears to date from the later 11th century. Here, it is related that the Tuatha De Danann, supernatural beings whom the text euhemeristically portrays as human magicians who settled in Ireland before the Gaels, aided the Athenians in a war against the Philistines. Although almost all of the Athenians perished in battle, the Tuatha De Danann were able to keep them in the field by using demons to animate the corpses of the fallen. When the Philistines complained to a local wizard that the number of their enemies never diminished, he advised them, "Take spikes of hazel and rowan wood with you to the battle tomorrow. And if you are victorious in the battle, thrust those spikes into the stumps of the necks of the men whom you will kill. And if they are demons, it will make heaps of worms of them." This advice brings success. The ability of the Tuatha De Danann to place demons in dead bodies, or, conversely, to give to human souls new bodies made of air, figures in some Irish tales from the later Middle Ages. But this is the only statement in an Irish source that is known to me of a method whereby such zombie-like beings could be disenchanted. The rationale is evidently to prevent the head from being restored to the body, as in the Norse practice of laying the unquiet dead by placing the severed head beside the thighs. Here, however, it appears to be the spikes of hazel and rowan wood that prevent the reattachment of the heads, and, by extension, the continuing activities of the demons whom the Tuatha Dé Danann have summoned. We have seen rowan wood mentioned earlier, as it is a rowan wand that is used to turn the heroine into a pool of water in Tochmhar Cédaine. But here, instead of being used to enchant a victim, rowan wards off evil spirits and counteracts witchcraft, a function that it serves in later folklore in Ireland and elsewhere in Northern Europe. It's curious that rowan should be regarded both as being involved in harmful magic and as being efficacious against it. Its sinister associations may in part be due to the originally pagan nature of its supernatural potency for good. That the hazel affords protection against witches and evil spirits is likewise a belief attested throughout Europe. Jacob Grimm called attention, moreover, to a curious passage in Egil's saga Skala Grimsonar, in which the protagonist places a horse's head on a hazel pole in order to lay a curse upon a territory and its rulers. Here, a severed head and a hazel spike again come together in a clearly magical context. Even if such specific comparisons are set aside, however, it still seems evident that the use of rowan and hazel in the Lever Gabhla Éireann episode has a background in popular counter-magical practices. The late Middle Irish saga Cath Finchoreth survives only in fragments, and even in these fragments the text is often in a damaged state. Early in the tale, as the armies of the rest of Ireland are preparing to fight against the men of Ulster, their leaders command their druids to advise them concerning the imminent battle. These were the offerings that they made to them, the meat of dogs, pigs, and cats. Thereafter, they went upon the hides of old hornless bulls, and upon hurdles of rowan, and their faces straight north toward hell. The gods whom they worshipped spoke to them. We've already encountered the meat of dogs, pigs, and cats being offered to pagan divinities in the account of Imbus Forosne in Sanas Cormac, and it would be perfectly reasonable to see no more than an echo of that earlier text here. As we shall see, however, there is some evidence that this may not be the whole truth. The bull hides and rowan hurdles, while they cannot be paralleled in any work of the Old or Early Middle Irish period, do find comparanda in later sources. The vernacular life of St. Berach, for instance, or Keating's Foras Fassa ar Éireann. A particularly rich source of material for the present inquiry is the saga Forvish Droma Davgera, dating probably from the 12th or perhaps the 13th century. In the words of Eugene O'Curry, this extraordinary tale contains more of the wilder feats of Druidism than any other Irish piece known to me. The interpretation of its testimony is, however, not entirely simple. As with all of the other stories that we have considered, we must of course ask ourselves whether the magical practices described represent authentic tradition, imaginative fiction, or some combination of the two. With Forvish Droma Davgera, however, the situation is further complicated by the circumstance that the tale that we possess is based on a lost earlier narrative mentioned in the Middle Irish tale list, the closeness of whose resemblance to the surviving text we are no longer in a position to determine. Moreover, the author had access to a poem, which I take to have been composed in the 9th century, which alludes to elements in this older form of the story. the author quotes 2 quatrains from this composition, and other details in Forvish Dromadavgra may reflect its influence. Purely literary features in the tale may accordingly be of 3 kinds: creations by the author of the story as we have it, recollections of the story in its earlier form, or attempts to interpret elliptical statements in the poem. The tale is concerned with a war waged in pagan times between the northern half of Ireland, ruled by Cormac MacArt, and the southern half, ruled by Fiachu Mullatham. In this struggle, remarkably, the principal combatants are Druids. Maghgrith, on the southern side, is the greatest of these Druids, and the south accordingly gains the victory. What sort of magic is performed in Forvish Dromadavgra? In many cases, magic is worked without any account being given of accompanying words or actions. Many spells are also included in the tale, curious compositions which I have discussed elsewhere. On one occasion, the druid Ferfoltha causes the waters of a stream to rise in flood by striking them 3 times with his wand or flesk of druidry. The most frequently mentioned instrument of magical agency, however, is the breath, the Anol Druid, druid's breath, or Anol Druidechta, breath of druidry. Thus the druid Fis MacAthish turns his face 3 times toward his pursuers, and then puts a breath of druidry upon them, which causes each of them to bear his appearance, so that they attack one another. This spell, or dian, of druidry can only be lifted when they are breathed upon again by the druids of their own company. The druid Art's breath produces a cloud of mist in which his enemies lose their way. Maghgrith, for his part, uses his Anol Druid on several occasions. Thus, having grown to enormous size, he blows on the hill where the enemy are encamped, which their druids have magically elevated above all other hills in the region. His breath causes a great wind with mist and cloud, and the hill shrinks to its former dimensions amid the tempest. His breath also creates clouds at other times. One of these falls upon the enemy camp, depriving its druids of their poison or sorcerous potency, while another, a black cloud bringing with it a rain of blood, also afflicts the invaders. Maghgrith's breath transforms the ground into wrathful, withering, bitter sods, which wound and burn the feet of the one who tries to walk upon them, and creates other obstacles as well. And, toward the end of the story, his breath turns 3 druids into stones. However much he may have elaborated this idea of magical breath, the author of Forvish Dromadavgra did not originate it. The Old Irish poem already speaks of Maghgrith's breath having stripped away the enchantment that was on the hill. There are repeated references to druids studying the sky in order to learn the future. They are described as looking at the clouds of the firmament above them, looking at the air and the firmament above the hosts, looking at the air and the firmament, and looking at the clouds and air. From 2 of these phrases, it is apparent that clouds in particular were regarded as omens, and indeed a cloud portending bloodshed appears at one point in the story. Similar cloud portents are attested in Irish tales from the 13th century onward, and it is evidently to divination of this kind that the word Néladóracht, found in texts from the later Middle Ages onward, should be taken to refer. Together with palmistry, sorcery, and scapulomancy, it is condemned in the Catechism of Flare o Maelchonra of 1593, and the Catechism of Togail Bruidne o Hussey of 1611 likewise includes it in its catalogue of offenders against the First Commandment. Beadle's Irish translation of the Old Testament, completed in the first half of the 17th century, similarly renders the astrologers of Isaiah 47:13 as Neiledori. Neiledor, in other words, was at that time the familiar Irish term for one who looks for omens in the sky. And the stern words of the catechists are evidently directed at what they perceived to be a pernicious contemporary superstition. There would appear, therefore, to be solid grounds for taking the earlier Irish references to such practices as having had a basis in actuality. The references in Forvish Dromedavgara may be the earliest instances of such divination in Irish sources. There is no way of determining whether such a belief arose at around the time of the tale's composition, or whether, on the other hand, it was only at this time that a considerably older practice was first mentioned in writing. The latter scenario seems, however, likelier. Regarding clouds as omens will be natural at any time and place, and is attested in the popular traditions of other countries. For another of the aspects of the magic of Forvish Dromedavgara, a comparandum can be found in the earlier rather than the later literature. I've mentioned that the Druid art escaped while his enemies were lost in the magic cloud that he had created. Thereafter, he used his magic to send those who were attempting to follow his tracks helplessly astray. Eventually, their own Druids were only able to bring them back again by dispelling the sleeping spell of a week to which they had been subject. This spell recalls the second of the three things that qualify a Druid, in one of a series of triads relating to the professions in the Old Irish legal treatise Bretha Nevydd Taoiseach. These are listed as victory against an unequal number, concealing a track, hostility of territories. The analogy between concealing a track and the spell described in our tale seems evident. Speaking more broadly, it's striking that all three of the things that grant Nevydd, or status, to a Druid are here associated with war. This is certainly appropriate to their role in Forvish Dromedavgara, but seems curiously narrow, given the range of functions that are attributed to Druids in other sources. A possible explanation seems worth mentioning. Bretha Nevydd Taoiseach has been dated to the first half of the 8th century. By this time, although it's evident that Druids still existed, most of the functions which they had once exercised had been taken over by the Christian clergy. There was, however, one very important aspect of Irish life from which the Church, at least in theory, held itself strictly apart, condemning its practitioners in terms that overlapped with its condemnations of paganism. This was warfare. Warfare would accordingly be one field in which the Druids could continue to exercise more or less unchallenged influence. And so it may have been in military terms that a Druid of the 8th century would have had the best opportunities to prove himself. To return to our story, another of its striking features is the account that it gives of the magical apparel and the magical implements of Mochryth himself. We are told that his skin of a hornless dun bull was brought to him, and his grey speckled bird garment, or einchenach, with its bird-like fluttering, and his druidical implements besides. Thus outfitted, Maughrith rises into the air, where he continues to contend on behalf of his people. With regret, and for reasons of time, I'll set the einchenach to one side for the present. Let us turn directly to the mysterious druidical implements. These are of two kinds: his handstone, or lialoive, and his fire-making equipment. Where it appears elsewhere in the literature, the phrase handstone refers to a stone thrown as a weapon. But Maughrith's lialoive has a different nature. Upon the approach of the enemy druid, Colptha, Maughrith commands, "Let my stone of poison, and my handstone, and my combat of 100, and my destructive reddening upon my enemies arrive to me." When this is done, he praises the stone and places spells of poison in it. The words of a lengthy enchantment are then given, beginning with the words, "I invoke my handstone, may it not be a stealthy phantom," and predicting that the stone will become an enormous eel that will enfold Colptha in 9 coils, and that will be the cause of his destruction. Maughrith then gives the stone to his disciple Kenvar, telling him to cast it into the water of a ford when Colptha enters it. This having been done, the transformation takes place. When the eel has rendered Colptha helpless, Kenvar cuts off his head. I am not aware of anything with which this vivid and arresting account can be compared. The old Irish poem says only that Kenvar slew Colptha in the ford. Is it the product of the author's own invention? There are no grounds for excluding such a possibility. If, on the other hand, it can be shown to be the case that, as I believe, all of the tale's other accounts of the working of magic resemble descriptions in earlier and/or later sources, then there is room for the conjecture that the transformed handstone also derives from some antecedent tradition, one which has, in this instance, left no other trace. And I can say in passing that although I'm not discussing incantations this afternoon, the incantations associated with the handstone are particularly elaborate and actually contain some fairly archaic use of vocabulary, which might suggest the same thing. The next threat is posed by the 3 sisters of Colptha, who change themselves into 3 monstrous and preternaturally destructive sheep. Against these, Maughrith deploys his remaining druidical implements: the fire striker of Simon, and the flint of Daniel, and the kindling of Ethior Ilchothach. He sets alight 3 wisps of the kindling material, which he then places in a fold of his garment. After he has chanted a spell over the wisps, they are placed on the ground, having become 3 puppies, 1 male and 2 female. As the sheep advance, these dogs mature with extraordinary speed, so that by the time that the sheep have reached them, they are able to destroy them in combat. A further intriguing detail is the statement that the dogs keep their mouths closed before the fight. For if their mouths were open while going into the combat, robber demons would be stealing their keenness from them. This episode is foreshadowed in the poem, which states, "They enchanted 3 sheep, on which there was the horror of battle. Maughrith, the great elder, formed hounds from his bone." While this is clearly a version of the same scene, however, the differences are notable. although such an elliptical account as that in the poem can only be interpreted with caution, it seems that the sheep are here created by magic, just as the dogs are, rather than being metamorphosed humans. The manner in which the dogs are created is, moreover, entirely different. Whatever is meant by saying that Magritte enchanted them from his bone, they are clearly not made by striking sparks. Here there is another parallel, which I find particularly puzzling. Hans Christian Andersen's tale The Tinderbox, first published in 1835. This story's central narrative device is that, when sparks are struck from a magic tinderbox, 3 dogs appear who are able to grant any wish. Unlike most of Andersen's stories, this one is based on a widely attested traditional tale. But in other versions, the supernatural helper or helpers produced by the tinderbox are giants, dwarfs, or an iron man. The 3 dogs appear to be peculiar to Andersen's telling. I can therefore see no alternative to regarding this resemblance, striking though it is, as being due to nothing more than coincidence, a conclusion with the uncomfortable corollary that other resemblances, equally striking, may also have such a basis. We come now to the last account of a magical ritual in Forvish Dromadavgara that I shall discuss. It's also one of the most elaborate. After the downfall of the various magical champions of the Northern Army, Kithruith, the chief of their surviving druids, proposes yet another supernatural means by which they can hope to prevail, the construction of a druid's fire, a Tenya Druith. When Magritte learns that this is being done, he instructs the men of the south to gather wood for a fire of their own. Bring a bundle of the hand of every single man of you, except for Fiahu alone, and let him bring with him a shoulder load from a hard tree which the birds of spring fairly excrete from the side of an upland where the 3 shelters meet, the shelter from the wind of March, and the shelter from the sea wind, and the shelter from the wind of fire, so that the fire may be lighted from the first kindling. When this wood is gathered, the fire must be laid in a prescribed manner, as a 3-edged cochin is, and 3 corners upon it, but 7 doors. Magritte lights this pyre with his fire striker, supplementing the wood with slivers cut from the spear shafts of the men of Munster. Owing largely to his subsequent intervention, the fire turns northward, and the final victory is gained by the men of the south. The most suggestive parallel to this ritual is afforded by the Old Irish saga Operative in its account of how a wandering people named the Déisi were enabled to appropriate lands in Munster that had been occupied by the Osriga. Here, the Druid of the Osriga prophesies that, when the armies of the Déisi and the Osriga are drawn up, no one shall slay or wound another, for the side of whoever first does this will be defeated. The Druids of the Déisi light a fire of rowan wood and send its smoke eastward into the territory of the Osriga, and the Osriga advance against the Déisi. Then the same Druids transform an old peasant into a red cow, promising him as a reward that his descendants will be ennobled, and the cow is sent toward the Osriga. The cow is killed, and when the victim's human form is restored after death, the Osriga realize that they must retreat. Though this scene revolves around a prophecy, and the magical means that are used to trick the Osriga into falling subject to its terms, the fire of rowan wood seems also to represent hostile magic of some kind, whether the sending of the smoke acts as a challenge or whether it actually induces the Osriga to advance westward. The similarity suggests that the Druid fires in Forvish Dromedavgra are based to at least some extent on older ideas. At the same time, the differences between the two stories are such that it would be far-fetched to explain the scene in the later text in terms merely of literary influence. This is not all of the evidence that can be brought to bear upon our topic, but enough has been considered, I think, to furnish the outlines of a broadly consistent picture. Magic, and especially the magic of the Druids, figures in Irish narrative from the earliest period, but indications of how that magic was performed are very scarce before the 9th century, and such accounts as we have relate mainly to the obtaining of knowledge by supernatural means. This bias in favor of the mantic persists in later sources as well. I have suggested that it may be explained by the fact that the filith, a class of poet-scholars who enjoyed exceptionally high status in early Christian Ireland, were themselves originally seers and retained strong links with this aspect of their identity. In the later Middle Irish period, and on into the early modern Irish period, there are more detailed descriptions of magical rituals. A particularly rich source of these is the tale Forvish Dromedavgra. In theory, such additional information could be due to authorial creativity, to the influence of foreign sources, or to access to aspects of oral tradition, which might have been regarded as more of a threat to orthodoxy, and which had in consequence been excluded from the written record in earlier centuries. In fact, I believe that all of these factors had a part to play, but I regard the third as the most important. Its author's imagination, of course, affects the telling of any story, and the more flamboyant the style of narration, the freer the rein that the imagination is likely to be given. The number of parallels that we have found for almost every element in the magical descriptions that we have considered, however, indicates that these tales were drawing on more than unbridled fantasy. It was inevitable that the Irish should compare their own magicians with those known to them from imported sources. Thus, the Druids who opposed St. Patrick are likened by Muirchú to the wizards of Pharaoh in Exodus, to the prophets of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel, to the Magi in Matthew, and to Simon Magus in the apocryphal Acts of Peter and Paul. Subject to correction, however, I am not aware of any descriptions of magical practices within medieval Irish narrative that appear to be indebted to foreign models in this way. Literary models were available to Irish authors had they wished to avail of them. Thus, Lucan's epic poem Pharsalia, which inspired a Middle Irish prose retelling, describes the magical powers of the magicians of Thessaly, and especially the necromantic rituals of the witch Erichtho, with a wealth of detail, to which, however, nothing in the material that we've been considering corresponds to any significant degree. Repeatedly, in the foregoing discussion, we've observed striking similarities between the testimonies of earlier and later Irish sources, and also between the medieval Irish accounts and later popular belief, both in Ireland and elsewhere in Europe. Such comparisons can only take us so far. I believe, however, that the evidence is sufficient to show that the descriptions of magical practices in medieval Irish tales have a basis in actual beliefs that in at least some cases were of great antiquity. The stories give us glimpses, within the manuscript record of a world that existed almost entirely beyond that record's confines, an ancient oral world of living magic. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, John.